Dave Asprey, welcome to Women's Wellness Radio.
I am really happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for accepting this invitation to come on our special Mold and Water Damage Week. And some people may know you from your Bulletproof brand and Bulletproof coffee, but it sounds like to me, the whole thing started firstly with your own ill health, and then later finding out about mold. So, can you take us back in time to your own personal mold story?
Sure. In my early 20s, I hit 300 pounds. I lost 100 pounds of fat since then. And I had arthritis in my knees since I was 14. I still have a bunch of stretch marks. I even wrote a little ebook about stretch marks a while back, just like, if only I would have known this when I started seeing them when I was 16. But I was always fat and puffy and pimples, even in my 20s when you're supposed to be done with that stuff. I ended up getting Hashimoto's thyroiditis. I was diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, toxic mold poisoning, and Lyme disease, and all sorts of unpleasant stuff. And when I look back on all the things I know after spending $1 million on hacking my own biology and turning my brain on in ways that never have been, I look back at where I grew up. And when I was a kid, I lived in a basement, a fully finished, nice basement, a nice house that had been flooded with some sort of a rainstorm or something, even before we moved into the house. I had nosebleeds every day as a young child. I had bruises all over the place, even when I didn't fall down, and I had asthma. I did not know this until years later, but those are classical symptoms of exposure to Stachybotrys, which is one of the most toxic forms of environmental mold. And when I look back on all the times my performance declined when I was doing really well, and all of a sudden, like, wow, I feel like I got hit by a bus, but I didn't even go out drinking to deserve this. It has to do with environmental mold. And when I wrote my first book about fertility, I included this because it's such a major factor. Mold, when you are exposed to it, there's about 200 species that make really bad toxins. They make a poison that affects you, and you get an immune response to the parts of the mold. This is affecting hundreds of millions of people. 1 in 4 of us is genetically extra susceptible, but all of us are susceptible to the direct poisoning of the energy production systems in our body. I mean, it's amazing how impactful this is. And when I look back on my life, avoiding mold and then getting rid of the toxins if I'm exposed is one of the biggest things I can do to continue performing really, really well, feeling good. And now I know it's not that I'm not trying hard enough. It's not that I can't pay attention, which is something that was a problem as a kid. It's that when you're working to pay attention and the parts of your body that make energy for that are just broken because of an environmental exposure, well, no wonder I was struggling as a kid.
Mm. So you did all this biohacking that you're famous for. You ran all these tests, found all this stuff. Like, who or what was it that made you realize like the mold is toxic and mold is something to be concerned about?
Well, I went to a variety of specialists. I tried all sorts of diets. I got to the point where my doctor told me that vitamin C would kill me. And I'd moved into the first condo I'd ever bought. And when we went to remodel it, I noticed that the carpet in the bedroom was wet. And I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. So we tossed out the carpet and got new carpet. And I thought that was done. And pretty soon I started putting weight back on. I'd lost about 50 of my 100 pounds. And all of a sudden it was coming back. And my emotions got really weird. My partner at the time, she was having all sorts of nightmares, and we both got puffy. Even my dog, from my parents' dog, came to visit me and got pneumonia in 2 days and almost died. And it's because every time I would go to sleep, I was like getting dosed with stuff in my own bedroom. And this is really common. It turns out it was a neighbor's water heater was leaking. I couldn't see anything, but it was there. If I'd known what I know now to get an air test, it would have been blatantly obvious. And then I would have moved out and I would have taken steps to fix my biology. So this idea that, wow, something in the environment could cause you to gain weight even on the same amount of food. So I went through this, but I didn't know. I went to the doctor and said, vitamin C helps. And the reason vitamin C helped is that vitamin C helps the liver to remove toxins more effectively. And the doctor said, Dave, vitamin C could kill you. And I just said, what about Linus Pauling? And Linus Pauling won 2 Nobel Prizes, only guy to do that, took 90 grams of vitamin C a day. And my MD looked at me and he goes, Linus who? And I said, you're fired because you don't know what you're talking about. If you're going to say vitamin C could kill me, you need to know the research. And I left. And for 4 years, I spent a huge amount of money and all of my spare time studying biochemistry and biology. And every night I'd learn something new and I would order the supplement or the technology or whatever it was. Just this relentless, I'm going to get on top of this or it's going to kill me because I'm really not feeling like myself. I'm becoming very successful in my career, but it's like I've got my foot on the accelerator all the way, but I'm slowing down instead of going faster. And I was genuinely concerned for my ability to, care for my family and just my own, like, I don't want to feel this way. Like, I don't like it when my joints hurt and creak all the time. I don't like being unable to focus or remember things. I don't like being quick to anger and all those things. So it was towards the end of that where I finally started seeing doctors again, but the right kind of functional medicine doctors, what we call them today. And one of the guys treated me. And this guy was an ear, nose, and throat surgeon who had become like more of an allergy specialist because he said, this surgery on your nose and throat doesn't work. So I only want to do what works. And after he saw me 3 times, he said, Dave, you're my worst patient. He said, you do everything I tell you and you don't get better. He said, my stuff works. It always works. He said, I want you to get an AIDS test. He's like, I do not know, but your immune system is not behaving the way it should. And he said, I don't think you have AIDS, but let's just rule that out. And I'm like, oh my God. So I got the test. I didn't have HIV or AIDS or any of that. And so he said, let's do this allergy panel. And I still have it. It's one of my early presentations. It showed that I had an allergic reaction to 9 of the top 10 species of toxic mold. And he said, Dave, that's your problem. He said, you have either had a previous exposure or you're still being exposed. And that led me to start doing huge amounts of research on the role of these toxins made by mold in our environment and then in our food and in our coffee and everything else. And now that's one of the many pillars of performing really well. Like, stop doing what's weak. You don't want mold toxins in your house. You don't want mercury in your food or in your house either. Like, there's other kinds of toxins. But this is something, you can have a perfectly normal house. You get a week of high humidity. You have a leak behind the sink. You get a leak in the roof or a flood. And my house was flooded where my parents lived later as a young man. That also affected me. And all of a sudden, what was a healthy environment becomes unhealthy. And with all the weather changes and things like that happening, I'm concerned because the experts I've interviewed for my documentary on mold, they're saying between 50 and 70% of houses have a mold problem. And I'll tell you, almost all public schools have a mold problem because they don't maintain their buildings well because they don't have the budget. This is a national epidemic, and it runs in families. The families that have all sorts of just chronic autoimmune problems, you look at that, they have the gene that makes them susceptible to mold, and they have mold in their environments. It always happens.
Mm. Yeah, so you had that first tip off with the allergy test and it opened up your whole world. So you and I are kind of those cases where it was in the home and we didn't know, or for you, maybe knew that basement flooded, but your parents and you, why would you think about it, right?
I was a kid and it didn't look flooded. There was nice paneling on the walls. There was no sign of it. But now I know the sign was when you get 10 nosebleeds a day that won't stop, that is a classical symptom of Stachybotrys. I had clotting problems.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. So I feel like I just watched your documentary and I feel like there's these crazy symptoms, right? People can't walk, people can't move, it's insane. But then when you go to the source of it, it's so unsexy. It's like a dripping pipe and, just stuff that we just don't think about as homeowners or building owners. It's I don't know. I've definitely been guilty of thinking a house is about the throw pillows and the paint, but a house is really about a structure that protects you and keeps you safe. And yet our buildings are making us sick. And your documentary goes into it really well, why that is. About the drywall is basically paper and mold loves to eat it when it gets wet and all this kind of thing. So there's that. And then there's also flooding and natural disasters, which is going on now, which is why I created this week. And I saw in your documentary, you checked out some houses after Hurricane Sandy. Is that right?
It was after either Sandy or Katrina. And in fact, this is a really interesting story that isn't in the documentary. It turns out my producer learned while filming the documentary that she was mold sensitive and had been her whole life. And it explained all of these weird health things she'd had. And we went to one house that had been flooded after the hurricane. And we'll just call it my spider senses. And when you've been exposed to mold and you realize that there is something in the environment, oh wait, when I walk into a moldy building, this is how it feels. The owner of the home said, oh, I didn't really remediate the basement, but it's okay. And he was still dealing with health problems. So I wouldn't go into the basement. I'm like, no way. I do not consciously expose myself to that, because with all the tools at my disposal, I can feel like myself again within a day, usually within a couple hours. Before, it was 6 weeks of feeling kind of like I had a hangover all the time. So I wouldn't go in, but my producer, she said, I'm going to go in. And she came out and had a PTSD attack, full on shaking like this. And she's like, I don't know what's going on. I feel like I'm going to die. And I'm like, I know what's going on here. What's going on is this is your body feeling like you're going to die because you just took a big hit of a toxin that specifically affects how your body creates energy. You had this much energy before, now you're down to here, and it feels like death. So that was a real wake-up call for her, and she ended up getting treated for environmental illness and resolving her mold symptoms, and it made a huge difference in her life. But that idea that one exposure, she could have just thought, maybe I'm crazy. And there's a lot of people who are on psychiatric meds who live in moldy houses, because what happens is that the mold attacks the lowest level form of energy in the body. Your body, about 10% of your body weight is these ancient bacteria called mitochondria, and we incorporated them into our cells. And if you think back to like 5th grade biology or something, antibiotics come from mold and they kill bacteria. Well, you and I are powered by bacteria. We use them to take food and air and make energy. So when you take these molds that poison the mitochondria, the power that it takes to be you gets poisoned. And the symptoms for you might be, I got rheumatoid arthritis, I got Hashimoto's, I'm tired. And for someone else, it's emotional issues. For someone else, it's skin issues. For someone else, your vision changes. So when a doctor sees someone with 12 symptoms, they're trained in medical school. And I'm married to an MD. They train in medical school. Like if someone has 10 or 12 symptoms, they're a hypochondriac. No one has 12 symptoms. And even worse, you get 3 people in the same house. One person has almost no symptoms. Another person has all physical symptoms. Another person has all mental symptoms. So we don't associate those together. And that's why this is one of the things that's hard to pin down. But now we understand the biology of this. And if a doctor says, oh, mold doesn't matter, like you need to get a new doctor. Like the evidence is very much in on this.
Yeah, and I've been studying up for this interview and watching some of your materials, and I had the whole list of symptoms, and so I knew it was fully possible. But I think after watching some of your materials, I realized how many other kinds of conditions that are involved that I didn't have, or not yet, that I was like, wow, so this could be a lot more widespread than I thought. And like you said, 1/4 of us is more susceptible. And then, I think how many people have a leak under their sink? Or my son's old school was like, put a bucket in the hallway because the ceiling I know, it kills me.
Kids are even more susceptible than adults. And what I do now, we bought our house and we knew it had toxic mold under the house and in one of the walls. So we remediated it before we set foot in the place. We tore things out and all that. And when I built the studios that we're recording in right now, I built them to be mold resistant. And I also started doing this. I actually helped to start the company. It's something called Home Biotic. And the mold that's poisonous, it's just a soil fungus. It's always been in our soil, but it's always there with bacteria. So Home Biotic is an environmental probiotic you spray around so that if there is water, or in areas like around windows where there's condensation or under the sinks, if water is present and mold tries to form, there's a bacteria that eats mold as its fuel source. So you end up creating a natural environment that fights the mold. So I missed pretty much all the potential areas of problems about every 1 or 2 weeks with Home Biotic. And that's part of my kind of safety net. But also if something smells funky or I see water, like, okay, fans, dry it out, like emergency situation. Whereas before I would have been like, oh, yeah, there's some stuff and I throw a towel under the sink, we'll call a plumber or whatever. Like, no, I take the door off the hinges, I blow a fan in there if it hasn't started molding, and we catch it quickly. And that's just so important. It is a very important situation if you have water, on the back of your couch, because you'll get mold between your couch cushions. And every time you lay on your couch, you might get runny, itchy eyes, or runny nose, or you might wake up the next morning feeling like a zombie and just not know why.
Yeah. I think you really opened up my eyes up to all the different conditions. I'll just tell you a little story that my aunt, and I've moved away and we haven't been in touch, but her husband recently died of cancer, and so we were on the phone just catching up and all that, and she went on to tell me that their old apartment had
Yeah.
chronic mold. And she's like, oh, I just try to rub it up, bleach it and scrub it, but it would always come back. And I was who
It
who
doesn't work.
knows? Who knows? Yeah, who knows? How his body developed cancer. But man, when I heard that, it just kind of broke my heart. It's like just this, we see
Oh,
a spot, we think, oh well, let me just try to clean it up. But there, so I wonder if you could elaborate just some of the diseases that we wouldn't necessarily think were connected to mold, but in fact can be.
every chronic neurological disease and cancer and diabetes and Alzheimer's have direct and meaningful links to toxic mold. It doesn't always cause them. All of these are tied to inflammation. And when you get exposed to mold, it cranks up inflammation in your body, and inflammation leads to these conditions. My parents had a lifelong dream of living in Alaska when they retired. So they moved up and they rented a house to spend there over the winter. And both of them started experiencing vertigo, nosebleeds, easy bruising, like all the signs of mold. And I'm on the phone with them, you guys sound like you're in a moldy house. Like maybe you need to do something. Like, oh, there's some shower mold. It's no big deal. So I went up there to visit them for Christmas. And oh my God, I've never been so sick in my life. Like literally within a day of being in the house, I got the neurological symptoms where like sounds would just like irritate me, and light was too bright, and my joints hurt, and I just felt drugged, and I was cranky, and my parents definitely had mold. And when they moved out, they had the house tested, and they had to condemn the house and literally burn it. It was just completely
Oh,
destroyed by mold. And within a few months of that, my dad had a heart attack. He'd
oh
had a
gosh.
clean bill of health a year before that. He did the calcium scan in his arteries. We didn't have anything, fully calcified. And I can show you the studies that show that mold triggers inflammation. It reduces mitochondrial function. It causes a calcium efflux in the cells. Can I prove 100%? No. Is it the most likely candidate? Yes. And there's a series of books out there with hundreds of studies talking about these diseases specific to mold. And one of the most powerful quotes out there is from the guy's name is A.V. Constantini at WHO researcher. He says, there is a known cause of atherosclerosis. It is mold toxin. And I don't think all heart attacks come from that. But I can tell you, in pigs, which are a great model for humans biologically, if they feed them moldy grains, they develop atherosclerotic lesions. And cancer itself is a disorder of your mitochondria. The mitochondria of the ancient bacteria, they decide if a cell becomes cancerous or whether it works normally. And they decide based on how they're performing in energy availability. When you give them a poison, they can become dysfunctional and then they become cancerous. And the world's most powerful cancer-causing agent is called aflatoxin. And aflatoxin is a mold toxin. It's the one that's found in peanuts. And it may be in your house. It's less common in houses, but not impossible. So when you look at these, there's a variety of toxins, a variety of genetic profiles for people, and a huge variety of symptoms. You're looking at 10 different toxins. There's actually more than that, but 10 primary ones. And then all these different types of people. No wonder that some people have these neurodegenerative things like Parkinson's and ALS and Alzheimer's are very clearly linked to mold toxin exposure. And then you get all these other things like diabetes, where you can't regulate your blood sugar, in part because your mitochondria are harmed by the environment you live in. And if you're looking to get pregnant or you have young kids, it's even more important that you handle this, because this is the time when babies in the womb, the first trimester, are so susceptible to toxin exposure.
Yeah, I found a video you did. It was only in 2012, but it still seems like a long time ago before your business was so mature. Just kind of someone with a basic camera filming your lecture, and you talked about the interplay between hormones and mold, and basically that sort of like the hormones will, you need the hormones to fight the mold, but the mold will knock down the hormones. And you were doing at the time some hormonal therapy. So do you want to just elaborate on that connection a little more?
Sure. One of the things that I discovered in my mid 20s was that I had less testosterone than my mom. Not a good thing in your mid 20s. And I was obese, and obese people tend to convert their testosterone into estrogen. And it's very common when people live in buildings or just work in buildings that have this toxic mold problem is they get hormone dysregulation. And it happens because the mold poisons the hypothalamus part of the brain or maybe the pituitary system. It's very common to have thyroid problems, especially Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which is a rampant problem, is oftentimes caused by toxic mold or exacerbated by it. So you go down this whole path of hormone disruption, and very particularly, a lot of the mold toxins are something called xenoestrogens. These are artificial estrogens that are thousands of times more potent than the normal human estrogen. And here's what xenoestrogens do for you. They allow you to gain weight with less calories.
Yay.
Wow. And you might say, well, that can't be. But in the animal husbandry industry, and I'm recording this on my organic farm, we have some sheep, but cattle ranchers know this. They purchase a mold toxin called zeranol, and it's made from zearalenone, which is one of the mold toxins that can be in your home if it's water damaged. And when you put a little waxy pellet with zeranol in a cow's ear, the cow's feed efficiency goes up by 30%, which means you can get the cow fat on 30% less feed. You and me, we don't want to get fat on 30% less calories. That sucks.
Wow.
But it also means if you eat meat from non-grass-fed, non-organic cattle, the odds of you getting some of this potent synthetic estrogen in the cow's fat are pretty high. It's one of the reasons I tell you eat organic, or better yet, grass-fed meat, because you're not going to be dealing with stuff like that.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you the food question next, but I'll take a quick time out to say that we will talk about how to get better. And Dave thinks Dave's done, because I know if you're new to wondering if you have mold or is it in your house, this can be like really shocking and daunting. But there are ways to get better that we'll talk about. But Dave, you're kind of well known for the conversation on mold in food. And I have to say, I think I dismissed this one, and I'm just starting to realize how big it is. I think because I had heard you talk about how certain foods will like make you hallucinate. And I'm like, that doesn't happen to me. I just have environmental mold. But then when I looked at the list of foods that contain mold, I'm basically sensitive to all of them. I just I just blamed it on other things. Oh, well, that's a food sensitivity. Oh, that's because I have candida. Well, that's because I'm dealing with mold. But it's actually the toxins in all these things. It's incredible.
Yeah, if you find you can tolerate it once when it's super high quality or super fresh, and then you don't tolerate it another time, it's not you. It's the difference in the food. And for me, coffee was a really big thing. I had learned, and most of the books and all like, oh, it's just environmental, it doesn't matter in food. But you look at what happens in animal studies, and specifically when they're growing animals for profit, they really measure this stuff. Mold contamination in food reduces profits in chicken and pigs and lambs and turkeys and cows and pretty much everything that you can feed. They track the amount of mold in the food, and they'll feed moldy food to animals before they butcher them, because the food is cheaper and it won't affect the growth rate of the animal. But when animals are going to get pregnant, they feed them the clean, more expensive food, because they know that mold reduces fertility in animals. This is from food mold, not environmental mold. So for us to say, oh, but it doesn't matter for people, or, oh, the food standards we have are safe enough. Well, I dug in on the food standards, and one of my favorite foods I gave up for 5 years. It's called coffee. And I quit it for 5 years because I would drink it and I would get like this anxious feeling 2 hours later, and I'd want sugar and I'd want another cup of coffee. And sometimes I get like joint pain, and it just wasn't worth it. So I determined, oh, I'm allergic to coffee. And then I came back from this long trip to Southeast Asia. I was in Tibet and all these things. And I had a cup of coffee, like high-end coffee. And I was like, oh, I feel really good. And the next day I had another cup of coffee and I felt crappy. I'm like, wait, I can't have changed from okay to not okay overnight. There's something else. And I dug in and realized coffee is a moldy food. And I realized that the US has no standards for mold toxins in coffee at all. But Japan, China, Europe, and most of South America have legal standards in the parts per billion range for mold poisons present in coffee. And I'm like, okay, so what if I could create a coffee that didn't have this and then lab test it? I could drink coffee again and I'd feel amazing. And I thought the market size for mold-free coffee was about 0, but I would put it up on my blog in case someone else wanted to help me, with the $10,000 of cost to do just the initial testing. And it turns out there was really interest in this. And I started kind of a revolution in the coffee industry. not just from the mold-free coffee, but the idea that milk and coffee takes away some of the goodness of coffee, but butter doesn't, and then adding brain octane oil. And it turns out people with mold sensitivities usually have mitochondrial dysfunction. When you add brain octane oil to your food or to your coffee, this is an extract of coconut oil that increases fat burning molecules in the body. Well, your mitochondria love fat burning. So if you're having mitochondrial dysfunction from mold exposure, and you can get yourself in ketosis via lifestyle changes using the Bulletproof diet, or just by adding brain octane to your coffee or to your food, anytime you have more ketones present in the body, you can use a different metabolic pathway in your mitochondria. And people with mold sensitivity usually feel better like on day one when they try Bulletproof coffee, like, wow, my brain turned back on. This is awesome. Like, I want to feel this way more often. And that's the gateway for them to start exploring all the other ways they can remove toxins from their body and learn to feel that way every single day versus, once every year, which, wow, today was a good day. Amazing. You just get used to feeling like crap.
Yeah. Yeah. I bet that brain fog is, I'm guessing it's like the most common linking symptom, do you think, between all of us?
Well, it can be, but it's really frustrating when one person has brain fog and the other person has really stiff, sore joints and muscle pain that won't go away, and the other person has eczema. So brain fog is a common one, but it's not always present. And that's what makes this so confusing. But it's extremely common. And the closest way I can describe this is if you've ever gone out and had way too many drinks, especially cheap drinks, which usually have mold in them, like cheap beer is particularly notorious for that. But you do that, you wake up the next morning, you're like, oh God, what just happened to me? Well, it's that feeling, but you didn't get to drink the night before. Like you're like, why do I feel kind of hungover today? Why can't I remember where I put stuff? Why did I forget this person's name? Where did I put my keys? Why did I open the fridge? Why am I at the store? I don't know what I'm shopping for. Like those sorts of, that's not normal, but for me it was normal because I was dealing with basically dysfunctional stuff.
So you're saying that's showing when we have those moments. We can't say for every single person, but it's often an exposure to mold-based food and mold, or in a building we're in.
It's a sign of a lack of energy production in the brain, and mold is a very common trigger. But if you have mercury poisoning, if you have type 2 diabetes, or you have any one of a bunch of other exposures, they could also cause that. And that's why my last book, Headstrong, is all about how to turn on mitochondrial energy production in the brain. And it's like, look, we understand how energy is made now. So if you've been exposed to a toxin, including mold, the odds are that some of your energy production doesn't work. So what could you do to patch that energy production so you have energy right now to go back and then do whatever other repair work in your body, or just to go on with life? A lot of us, like me, I have 2 young kids and I have a job as now CEO and podcaster and author and maybe too many jobs. But to have this level of energy, I didn't have that for a lot of my life. And to have it now, it's because I consciously control how much energy my brain has. And that was why I wrote a book about it. And I use supplements and I use foods and I use ketosis and breathing exercises and meditation. But also I detox. And if I'm exposed to mold, I very aggressively go after it before it can spread throughout my tissues. And it's usually not a mold infection. It's actually a toxin that spreads throughout. You can get mold in the sinuses. Alzheimer's is highly correlated with fungal infections in the brain, believe it or not. So you can get an infection like Candida, but quite often that's a symptom of environmental mold exposure.
So we're starting to dip into some of the things you did to help yourself with the cleaner coffee and the fats. And let's just keep going. What are some other hacks you would recommend for the person out there who knows they have mold or suspects they have mold?
One of the biggest parts of your mold detox system is your liver, and it relies on a compound called glutathione. And glutathione is the primary antioxidant and detoxing molecule throughout the body and in the brain. So I've been using glutathione for a very long time. Bulletproof manufactures an orally absorbable one. When I was doing aggressive healing, I did intravenous glutathione, it's relatively expensive compared to an oral form. And that can really help with mold. But one of the simplest things comes from the US military protocols. And it's something that ranchers and farmers use. And it's called activated charcoal. And activated charcoal has been used for thousands of years for toxin binding. I manufacture one that's very specifically designed for binding toxins in the gut. It's called Bulletproof coconut charcoal. And you can take it if you're eating moldy food, or very specifically, if you know you've been exposed to mold, you take activated charcoal to bind toxins in the gut. And in the protocols for mold detoxification, you'll almost always find activated charcoal as part of this. If you take too much of it, it can make you constipated. But I know if I walk into a moldy building and I start feeling dizzy or I start feeling like my ability to concentrate waver, I will always take glutathione and charcoal spaced apart from each other, because charcoal will absorb any prescription drug or most other supplements you take with it. So it's one of those powerful binders in the gut. The secondary detox pathway that I work with is called glucuronization in the liver. And the compound that helps with that is called calcium D-glucarate. This is also something that I make at Bulletproof. It's an unusual supplement. And so what I've done is I've taken the first and second most powerful detox pathways and I upgraded them. And you do that and you take charcoal to bind toxins so you don't have to detox it. And that can help enormously. But what you're dealing with here is a systemic inflammation problem. And that means you're going to have to cut sugar out. I find that most people who've been chronically exposed for a long time, they benefit greatly by working with their doctor to be on antifungal medication. The normal one is called fluconazole, and nystatin is another one. These can knock out candida, but sometimes 30 days of this can really shift what's going on in your body so that you feel better. And for people who can get it from a compounding pharmacy, an oral antibiotic called amphotericin B can be really dramatically effective, but most doctors are afraid of it because intravenously it's a last line defense. Orally, it's relatively harmless and it'll knock out almost every fungus in your body. It's kind of a powerful thing.
So let me ask you a question. Do you think that mold can be cleared fully, effectively without prescription intervention, or does it depend on the person?
It depends on the person, but honestly, if you've been exposed, if you've lived in a house for several months and you have these symptoms and you know it, you will experience a more rapid recovery if you use pharmaceuticals than if you don't. One of the other pharmaceuticals that's really important is called cholestyramine. It's a very old anti-cholesterol medication. It's very harmless because it doesn't get absorbed in the body. All it does is it sticks to the bile that is recirculated in your body. It turns out that people like you and me who are more likely to be sicker for longer from mold exposure, we're genetically modified to ride a horse into a village, take a couple arrows in our arm, pillage the village, steal all the food, get exposed to new diseases, and then run away and live another day. And what that means is our blood clots quickly so we don't bleed to death. And it means our immune system is highly active so we don't get sick from the local thing. So there's definitely some Northern European, but it turns out these genes they're global. And that's great because we're more likely to survive in certain environments. But in an environment where there's a chronic threat like mold, our blood becomes sticky and we have circulatory problems and we get a chronic immune response from the mold because our immune system's trying to protect us. So when you're dealing with that sort of stuff, cholestyramine, oh, and by the way, those genes mean that we conserve our bile, we recirculate it better. The mold toxins we're talking about dissolve into fat. And since bile is made of fat, by capturing the bile with charcoal, with extra fiber, with cholestyramine, that can totally allow you to get rid of these toxins faster. But if you've had them for a long time, because they dissolve into fat, every cell in your body is made of tiny droplets of fat in the cell membrane. Your nervous system is lined with fat. So if these toxins are permeated, it can take a couple of years of regular toxin binding before your body builds new membranes of clean fat, which means you don't eat mold, you don't breathe mold, and you keep binding this fat. So you just work it out. Imagine you have a cup of water, you put one drop of blue dye in there and it spreads out everywhere. And if you put it under the sink and you turn on the water, it takes a while for new water to come in and push out the old water before you have perfectly clear water. We're doing that with the fat in our bodies and not just the fat around our waist. Your eyes, your brain, your skin, everything is tiny droplets of fat held together in a matrix.
Okay, so we've got cutting out sugar and we're going to have
grains.
Grain. Okay.
Cut out all grain, especially whole grains. Grains are a moldy food and they piss off your immune system. You've already got an irritated immune system. If you're exposed to mold, grains are only going to make it worse. You might handle white rice. That one tends to be relatively innocuous. But all the other grains, including the gluten-free grains, throw them out. You won't like it. And this is all on the Bulletproof Diet Roadmap. You can get it for free. It's on bulletproof.com. Just search for Roadmap. You can download it, put it on your fridge. It's designed for high-performance humans, but it's amazing. When you eat that way and you have mold sensitivities, it works really, really well because it cuts out the moldy foods and it cuts out the irritating foods. And it tells you the right kinds of fat to eat and to eat enough of them to help the body reprocess and to rebuild itself with the right fats.
Yeah, I think it's good to emphasize that because we might be getting some people exposed to this who are really kind of new to healthcare, self-care, so to speak. And the diet is so foundational. And you can see a mold specialist physician or you can try some of these supplements. But if you're going to keep having sugar and processed foods and all this stuff, it's just weakening your body and you can't fight this.
Even more important than your diet is the environment you're in. If you're still in a moldy house, you have to get out. And I know that when I say that, people are saying, but I can't afford to get out. You can't afford not to get out, even if you have to live in an RV or a tent. And there are people in the documentary who actually had to do that in order to get well. And what happens when most people get out of a moldy environment is they go in and they grab all their stuff and they leave. The unfortunate thing is that anything porous, papers, books, pillows, bedding, anything that you can't dry clean will carry the mold spores and the mold toxins with it, and you'll contaminate your new environment. And that sounds like, oh, for God's sake, really? I still have a box of papers. It's a plastic sealed box from when I lived in a house with Stachybotrys. If I open that box of papers and I take one breath of it, I get brain fog within 5 minutes. The stuff is poison, right? So if I have to go in and look at some old records, I do it far away from the house in sunlight and I hold my breath and wear gloves. Okay. Am I paranoid? Actually, I'm not. This is well documented in books about mold. It's documented in the literature. So when you leave, you keep your stuff that you can clean effectively. You dry clean all your clothes and you leave your mattress, you leave your couch, you leave your pillows. And you unfortunately need to leave a lot of your books as well. If the books haven't been opened and they haven't been sitting in a moldy thing, you might be able to kind of wet mop the top of them and HEPA vacuum them. And that can save a lot of your library. But this is a big deal. If you spend all the money to get out of your house and you keep stuff like that, you're not going to like how you feel.
Yeah, it's so true. And it's easy to make that mistake. I made that mistake the first time we moved. Luckily, it was to a temporary house. So thank God we hadn't bought that house. Yeah, I mean, it's so hard. I totally get it. And I was totally one of those people who, and you say this in your documentary, it's like you're sick and you're tired and you don't have the energy to move. Never mind like deal with like the emotional, financial stress of getting rid of all your stuff. But like you said, you can't afford not to. And I hope with your documentary and this resource and other resources that people who, are in a natural disaster make better choices right away. Or people who find that mold behind their wall make better choices. Another mistake we made was to stay in while it was remediated because a lot of the contractors don't tell you. They say, oh, we'll run these fans and we'll put the plastic in. That was a huge, huge mistake for us. It really ruined our stuff.
Here's something that happens. The first thing that happens if there's a mold outbreak in your house, and this happened in a place where I was living, we were generally pretty healthy, and we had the dishwasher replaced. The old one had been leaking for probably a couple of years, and we didn't know it. The day they replaced the dishwasher, I just lost my willpower. Like I'd wake up and like my digestion went all to hell. I'd wake up feeling like I didn't sleep. My dogs quit eating. My wife got sick, and we're just like, wow, like what just happened? We didn't know it was mold. And I found out a couple of weeks later, I figured it out from the symptoms. Like, oh wait, we have mold. And then we did a mold test, and we had 88 times more toxic mold in the kitchen than we did outside. So, okay, It's toxic. But given who I am and what I do, you'd think I'd have moved out, right? You know what we did? We put up plastic and put up a negative pressure fan, because the first thing mold does is it just saps your ability to make decisions. It sucks away your willpower, and you're just too tired. You can barely put one foot in front of the other. So we lived there for a couple more weeks before we got out. And that cost us, from a health perspective, it was totally unnecessary. And it's like, even if you have to ask relatives or you have to camp in the backyard, I'm not kidding. If you're in a house with recently disturbed toxic mold, it is really important for your future. You don't want Alzheimer's disease 20 years from now. You don't want heart disease next year. And you don't want to feel like crap for a year or two. You just get out. Like it's really important.
Yeah. And we just got to keep saying it. And hopefully we'll get in front of it. This is so horrible and embarrassing, but your documentary came out before my own mold exposure. And it came out and I was like, oh, that seems interesting. I just never got around to watching it, you know?
Oh yeah.
And then I got into my own crisis and I didn't know any of that. That one hour of watching that could have saved me so much. So just, it just goes to the whole health education issue. In general, we just need to be aware of what we're dealing with in a modern world with water, and these paper houses don't really mix. We need to be aware of that.
When I filmed Moldy, the documentary, Bulletproof had just gotten big enough to afford to do it. And it was the first thing that I did. And it was almost $200,000 to make a real documentary like that. I hired someone who worked on $1 Million Baby. The music is from the guy from Electric Light Orchestra, Eric Troyer. Like, it actually has its own custom soundtrack, which he kind of threw it in because they believed in the mission. And I did this because everyone told me I was crazy about toxic mold. And when you have Dr. Amen from Amen Clinics, and you have Dr. Mark Hyman, the head of functional medicine for Cleveland Clinic, and all these experts in a documentary, and then you talk to a dozen people who are like you and me who are affected, you can no longer see this movie and tell someone they're crazy. And if you show this movie to your doctor can no longer dismiss your symptoms because their peers who know more than they do about this specific subspecialty are talking about it. So it was meant for that. And I kind of feel like I've failed on some levels because I haven't got enough people to watch it. Because once you know this, you look to your left and you look to your right, there are people all around being affected by this. So it's a big public health thing. And it matters so much to me because if someone had told me this when I was 12, like, my behavior in high school would have been different. I wouldn't have been fat the way I was. I wouldn't have stretch marks. My life would have been a lot easier, and I don't know what I'd be doing, but it might be even cooler than what I'm doing now. But on the other hand, I'm grateful I got exposed, and my path has led me to some knowledge that's unusual, that's let me help millions of people, and I wouldn't give that up. But man, I wrote my blog, and I still write my materials because if someone had given me this knowledge when I was younger, it would have saved me like hundreds of thousands of dollars and so much struggle. And that's why I'm happy to support what you're doing here, because if one more person hears about this and dodges a bullet as big as this, like, this whole amount of time we're spending, all the effort is totally worth it for just one person.
Yeah, I mean, it's a living nightmare. Like, I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy, what my family went through. So yeah, I'm really happy to spread it to you. And I know you took a lot of flack, Dave, for talking about this. I was looking on YouTube. I'm like, oh, this poor guy. I mean, I couldn't have done it. I couldn't have taken what you took.
Oh, well, all the critics come from one source, right? There's a guy whose life was absolutely changed by Bulletproof Coffee, by his own admission, a well-known podcaster. And when one of his friends decided to try and steal my brand and to try and copy my products, that day he started saying, that I was lying about mold and all this stuff. But there's so many top experts, like a whole nother level of expertise, who are fully behind this message, and they recognize it and they see it on brain scans. It's like, if a comedian, wants to try and smear my reputation, like, whatever, like, just say my name while you're doing it so people can find my website and they'll judge. So, but it's kind of funny. I can take that because every time you talk about Bulletproof, every time you talk about mold, you're talking about mold, and that's what I wanted. Like, I always win.
It's true. Because if they dig in, they learn more about it.
Oh yeah. And the science is clear.
Yeah. And you are very generously sharing this movie that cost you a lot to make for free for a little while. Kind of just like me during this hurricane season, you were like, I need to get this out there. So we will share that link. And do you want to just give a little more intro to it?
Sure. So normally the movie is it's not a profit generating movie. We'll put it that way. It was an act of social good. But I've been trying to get it to pay for itself for a while, just by charging a nominal fee to watch it. But after those two mega hurricanes, and apparently a third one on the way, and just looking at the number of houses with water damage, like, look, it's free. So just go to moldymovie.com and you can watch it. And it's one of the bonuses for this as well. We may need to get a special code for you if I turn off the free access to it. But I just want people to see it, because my house was flooded. It was in 6 feet of water in my mid-20s. And I went in there. I hadn't figured out this mold stuff yet. And when the water receded, we tried to save the house. And I remember all the symptoms coming back. And you're working there trying to save your possessions and shoveling muck and all this. And you see the mold on the walls. But I wasn't even wearing proper respiratory gear. And now, after filming Moldy and doing my research, I actually just wrote a blog post on the Bulletproof website. Like, here's the type of respirator you need. Those paper masks don't do anything. You need like an N95 respirator and goggles and a Tyvek suit because the stuff absorbs in your skin. And in the movie, you can see me going in to a really water damaged house. And even though I had duct tape on my sleeves, I got sick from doing that, even with a respirator. And the cool thing is, the entire camera crew, all of whom thought we were basically a bunch of crazy people for filming this, they were a little lax with the safety protocols. I'm like, no, you got to put that on. And that night, all of them like, oh my God, like I feel really awful. Like, this is real, isn't it? I'm like, yeah. Like, we traveled around together for 6 weeks filming this, crossing the country, meeting with all these experts and all these people who've experienced mold from all walks of life. And like, okay, now we get it. And so if you're watching this and you're cleaning up your house, spend the $150 on the best Tyvek suit you can get, on the proper respirator, the face shield, all that stuff if you're going to go into your house. And never, ever wear those Tyvek overalls in your car. Never take them into your new house. And when your house is you think it's clean, test the air. And Moldy tells you all this kind of stuff, but until you see the movie, it's kind of hard to just put the emotion and just the visceral sense here. I don't want to be a fearmonger. It's stressful enough. I know, because I went through it. When you lose your house because it's damaged or destroyed by a flood, ours, it turns out, was destroyed. But even worse is to have your house destroyed and then to have your health just wrecked as a result of that. You have enough stress going on right now. So take care of your biology. Your house can be replaced. Your health could take you years to replace. So if you can go in and fix your house with the right protective gear, that's not fear. That's just wise. And I just wish I'd known this when I was young. I wish we'd known to get me out of my basement bedroom and to fix that up and clean the air, because like that would have been such a gift. And now we know, and it's part of my mission to make people know that. The other thing that I'd love to mention is I have a portfolio of companies that I've started to solve like major problems out there. And Bulletproof is disrupting big food. And we're making food that gives you energy and things like that. Homebiotic, where I'm a co-founder, this is a company that's there to solve the world's problem with mold. And the way to solve that is to have a natural enemy of the mold that's always present in your home. So Homebiotic is something that I literally sprayed the equivalent of 100 bottles of that around as I was building Bulletproof Labs, where I'm sitting now. And it's something that I use in my house every week to just as an insurance policy and to keep mildew and things like that from forming. And I think it's a part of a strategy if you're cleaning up your house, or if you've just cleaned it up and you want to make sure it stays clean. And you've got to air test your house before you move back in. It might look clean, but if you test it and it's not clean, you need to know. And you need to work on that before you go in there. Because the worst thing you do is, oh, it looks pretty good, I'm going to move back. And then all of a sudden you can't work because you're just too tired. And this happens, and it happens so many times that it's with these recent hurricanes, I'm worried about that. Like I care a lot, and I know I'm already seeing questions on the Bulletproof forums and things, and I take as much time as I can to answer those. And because like I didn't know anything else more important to shift the needle in someone's life. You avoid this, you'll keep doing what you're doing, and if it hits you, it can take a couple of years, or it might turn on some stuff that we don't know how to turn off yet. So like, just be cautious, be aware.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, it's devastating to lose your home and your possessions, but there is an opportunity to save your health. And I think you and I both are just like, man, we just want people to know, like, don't make my mistake. Like, watch this documentary. Please share it with your practitioner friends. Share it with people who you know are affected. Share it with someone who's just sick and has asthma and fatigue, and maybe they need to know like that they could have mold. So yeah, we
you
just
have to rule it out.
Educate. Yeah.
And Bridget, what you're doing is awesome, because you're talking to mold inspectors and house inspectors and all sorts of people involved in this. And that's a great public service for people. So I'm grateful you're doing that. And every time we see another blog post or another interview about that, it just raises people's consciousness of this, because it's not that big of a deal. If we all acknowledged it and we cleaned up all of our schools and we cleaned up the moldy environments and we're like, oh, like this place is moldy, no big deal. There's insurance for that. Or there's humidity detectors. And there's all sorts of stuff we could do. But as long as we have people usually backed by big insurance saying, oh, there's no such thing as toxic mold, like, come on. Like, there is such a thing. But when we all acknowledge it, then it's It's one of those things like public hygiene, public sanitation, clean drinking water. It's the same kind of issue. We now all have clean drinking water. We should also have clean air in the buildings we go into. It's that level.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just a modern health risk with modern housing, unfortunately.
It
And,
is.
and maybe with climate change too, with all these storms and all that. So yeah, but thank you so much for being bold and sharing this message seriously. Thank you for making the movie, and we're happy to share it. And thank you for everyone who's watching to learn with us, because if it weren't for you, we'd just be talking to each other.
There you go. Thanks, Bridget. Have a beautiful day.
You too, Dave.